introducing tonight's speaker, who is Claire Davey.
This is like what comedians do, isn't it? They go behind the stage and introduce themselves before they walk out. It's a bit tragic because I haven't got any pedigree, but yeah, thanks CJ and ASAP for having me tonight. My name's Claire Davey. As Christian said, I'm live in Northampton and I'm a sort of frazzled mum of two. And one of my girls has just recently become a teenager. So I have really enjoyed the last few talks on exorcism, demonic possession, and that. I think they'll actually come in really handy, to be honest. Yeah, I'm quite nervous and talking in front of you all because I know that you've all got loads and loads of experience in this field and probably loads of letters before and after your name. I don't have any of that. I have sort of a bit of life experience. I have a degree in theology and Irish history, and I have 35 years of just loving this subject and particularly this story. And that's why I'm talking about it tonight. I mean, I have no more right than anyone else to talk about it, but I do love the story and I hope you enjoy it. And after the talk or on the chat, you can sort of ask me anything you want to ask me. If I can answer, I will. If I can't answer, then I'll just probably pretend the screen is frozen, to be honest. I think that's probably the best way to go, or leave it to Christian. So yeah, so I'm ready when you are, Christian. Are we okay to go?
I think that was the best introduction we've ever had, actually. That really told us more about the speaker than most. Okay, Claire, do you want to start sharing your screen? And
Yes.
I'll carry on letting people in.
Perfect. Okay. Now, Christian promised me he was, yeah, going to help me with this, Christian. Okay, there we go.
Okay,
Okay,
so there's play button at the top or the first one, either of them
Yeah.
should work.
Okay, good.
Huzzah!
Yeah. Huzzah.
Excellent, you've done it.
So I was going to say for the first little bit of this talk, just close your eyes and sort of wish yourself away 4,000 miles to Barbados. But then I thought, no, don't actually close your eyes because I spent ages on this talk and then you won't see the slideshow. And I've been sweating about this slideshow all week. So anyway, we're just going to go to Barbados in the Caribbean Sea. It's an island in the Eastern Caribbean and it's part of the Lesser Antilles Island Group. It's an independent Commonwealth nation. And as so, Elizabeth II is its head of state. So it's home to 200,087 inhabitants. And it's only 20 miles long and 15 miles wide. So it's quite a small island. The main religion is 75% Christian, and that's 23% of that's Anglican. And the chief economic industries there are sugar, light manufacturing, and tourism. So Barbados, if you haven't been, it's famous for a lot of things. It's very safe to visit. It's extremely beautiful. And it's known for rum, beaches. It's known for Rihanna, Bajan food, and cricket and things like that. And before COVID hit, there was about 680,000 people a year visiting. I mean, that's obviously going to have taken a massive hit now, but it was growing year on year exponentially. So what exactly happened in this beautiful island that brought the dark side of Barbados to the attention of the paranormal world? So I'm going to show you this map here. If you look down at the bottom where I've put this little skull in, you have no idea how much that work that was. This is Oistins. So this is where the story actually starts from. And yeah, so the Chase Vault is a stone tomb. It's 12 foot deep by 6 foot wide, and it lies in the parish of Christchurch in Oistins, and that's on the south coast of Barbados. The tomb itself lies in the west end of the churchyard, and it's built into the cliffs which overlook Dover Beach. Part of the tomb is above the ground, and it's comprised of it's sort of one piece of concrete, and then it was topped with a marble slab, but that's gone now. The majority of the tomb, however, lies 6 or 7 steps down into the earth. And it's actually hewn out of the limestone and the coral that are basically, that's the land of Barbados. That's what it's made out of, limestone and coral. And it's got a lovely arched ceiling inside. It's absolutely tiny. I'll show you a photo later that shows actually how small it is. It's a lot smaller than you think it's going to be. So the story. In 1807, the vault was briefly owned by a family called the Goddards. There was, before that, it was owned by another family, and the only incumbent in the vault at that time was called James Elliot. When the Goddards bought the vault, the first person they had to inter there in 1807 was a distant relative of theirs. She was Thomasina Clark, but she was related to the Goddards. So when they opened the tomb to put in Mrs. Clark, the body of James Elliot was gone, completely gone, not moved or anything. He was gone, the coffin was gone, there was nothing there. So quite unexpectedly, Mrs. Clark was to spend her eternal slumber at least for a year in the tomb on her own. Then in 1808, the following year, the vault was purchased by the Chase family. Thomas Chase, the Honourable Thomas Chase, although I'm not sure how much that title is appropriate when I tell you what I've read up about him, he was a very rich man. He was a plantation owner, but despite his wealth and everything, he was very cruel. He didn't differentiate much between his slaves and his children when it came to meting out harsh punishments. And apart from, I mean, the family themselves, fiscally and mentally, they had everything they could want, but he wasn't well liked because of his temper. People just didn't like him on the island. So the first member of the Chase family, tragically, that was to require some room in the tomb was a little girl. She was 2 years old at the time. She was called young Mary Anna Maria Chase, but she's more often known as Anne Maria. So she passed away. Infant mortality at the time was high, so that wasn't unusual in itself, although it was tragic. But even by those standards, it was really sad. And her death came about, and it was sudden, and it was quite heartbreaking. And many people said that it came about as a result of something to do with her dad. So very tragically, she was taken to the tomb. But then what happened a couple of years later in 1812 was probably even sadder and sort of compounded the tragedy that sums up the family. Anne Maria's sister, Dorcas, she was 12 years old. So since her younger sister had died, she'd obviously been grief-stricken, missed her very much. And now there was no one between Dorcas and her father, Thomas, and there was no one to stop his cruelty being meted out to her. And she was treated very, very badly. So after a while, this poor 12-year-old just stopped taking food altogether. Week on week on week, she just wouldn't eat. Eventually, she faded away and she died. So she was the second person, a poor child, who needed their coffin in that tomb. So, I mean, it might be the fact that Thomas was guilt-stricken about the death of his daughters. Probably not, judging by the sort of person he was. His own health failed anyway, and basically he sort of joined Dorcas and Anna Maria within the year, so he was also put in the tomb. Did he commit suicide, Thomas? Because that's another theory, and it's a theory that Arthur Conan Doyle was sort of keen to espouse, because he felt that if of the 4 bodies in the Chase, so there was now Thomasina Clark, there was Anna Maria Chase, and then 2 suicides potentially, Dorcas and Thomas, if he had committed suicide. So if there was 2 suicides in that vault, could that potentially have had a hand in what was to come later? But even so, up to this point, the story was sort of no more than very tragic, very sad. The few friends and neighbours that were inclined would come along and visit the tomb, and they'd probably run their hands over the tomb and come and see the girls mainly, I would imagine. But on the day in 1812, when Thomas Chase was to be interred, everything changed. There was this small, as you can see, relatively unprepossessing tomb on the grounds of a parish church in Oistins, Barbados, and it was going to become a mystery that was spread first throughout the fields with the slaves, and then it went through the Bajan townlands, across the island, and then across the waves. There was letters and telegrams written about it. So it was to become something very, very strange that was to be talked about for many years. But it's never become, so it's never been any closer to being solved than it was 2 centuries ago, which to me is kind of the enduring thing about it. I'm just going to write, this chap here is a Scottish explorer who's called James Edward Alexander, and he provides sort of a more contemporaneous account of the events that happened at the time. And he wrote in his Transatlantic Sketches about the case itself. By the way, I had the opportunity to read, and I did, because I never turn my nose up at a bit of procrastination. When I've got something to do, I can always be guaranteed to do something else or read something else. So when I was trying to put this talk together, I did actually read Transatlantic Sketches, and it's fascinating if you ever want to know a little bit about what was happening in North America and Canada at the time. It basically details his travels through the swamps of New Orleans and things, so it's well worth the read. But anyway, Alexander writes, when the vault was opened again in late 1812 for the burial of the father, Thomas Chase, the caskets of the Chase girls were found to be in a confused state, having been apparently tossed from their places. When the vault was later opened to receive the body of another infant, the 4 coffins, all of lead, all very heavy, were much disturbed. And similar disturbances were found when opening the vault for burials in 1816 and 1819. Each time the vault was opened, the coffins were replaced in their proper situations, that is, 3 on the ground side by side, and the others laid on them. The vault was then regularly closed. The door, a massive stone which required 6 or 7 men to move, was by masons. And though the floor was of sand, there were no marks of footsteps or water. The last time the vault was opened was in 1819, with the governor of Barbados, Lord Combermere, present. When opened, the coffins were found confusedly thrown about the vault, some with their heads down and others up. What could have occasioned this phenomenon? In no other vault on the island has this ever occurred. Was it an earthquake which occasioned it, or the effects of an inundation in the vault? So that's what James Alexander wrote about the case, and that was one of the first cases to make it back to England and the rest of the world, and enabled us to know about this. So in the next slide, we can see a representation. Now, if you go on Google, you can find lots and lots of different variations of the same theme, how the coffins were before and how they were found when they were opened afterwards. So what was it the pallbearers saw when they lifted up Thomas Chase's heavy coffin and prepared to go down the 6 or 7 steps into the gloom? In the first instance, when it was Thomas Chase's funeral, although it was the start of the phenomena, there wasn't that much to see. The other coffins were largely as they were, except for Dorcas. Now, Dorcas was the 12-year-old. Her coffin had apparently been moved out of its original position, turned fully upside down, and placed against a wall as if to balance it. Actually makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up a little bit, doesn't it? Everyone there was obviously slightly curious, but they sort of quickly, maybe even too quickly, just attributed it to vandalism or somebody playing tricks, or maybe even the slaves having a go back at Thomas Chase, because like I say, he was really not a popular man. So they put everything back as it was. They put Thomas Chase's big lead coffin down, Thomasina's Clark, and then they put the 2 children, and then the new child that had been in there, they put him on top as well. But the strange situation was only going to get stranger. In 1816, the funeral took place of Samuel Brewster, who had been murdered during a slave revolt on a nearby plantation. Once again, the coffins were in disarray when the tomb was opened. They were tumbled around the tomb like a violent earthquake. By now, people were extremely fearful of what they saw as a malicious voodoo or a sort of magic, black magic that had invaded their island, invaded their dead, and was intent on evil. And there was a letter at the time written by Mrs. Eleanor Daly to Mr. Roger Senhouse, and she states, many people have been inclined to attribute them to poltergeists or other supernatural agencies. Well, I don't think it would have taken much of a leap of, imagination. It's an island. There is a lot of belief in voodoo. There's a lot of folk tales. So obviously people would have been talking. And in that instance, I think a paranormal explanation would have been one of the first things they arrived at. So just going back to the little lad here on top of Thomas Chase's coffin, he is Samuel Brewster Ames. Sadly, he died at 11 months old. Again, just one of the casualties of the high infant mortality rates. Even though 6 years had now actually elapsed, because we're in 1818 now, 6 years has elapsed since Thomas Chase was laid to rest and the whole thing started. You can imagine, though, that there was still a lot of interest in the vault, and that when people came to mourn and lay Samuel Brewster Ames, the young little boy, they probably all rushed forward and had a look. And those who had a ringside seat to look into the tomb must have had just a mixture of shock and horror and revulsion. So the coffins, the 5 of them, which were soon to become 6, were in varying states of disarray and scattered throughout the tiny tomb. They'd been tossed violently about the tomb. And this initial one, this Thomasina Clark, Hers was actually made of wood. Now, in some places it says they were all made of lead. Hers was made of wood. Hers was the first one that was in, if you don't count James Elliot, whose coffin disappeared. The coffin that was made of wood had been chipped, and it had been chipped so badly that part of the body was visible. It was broken open, basically, nearly on the floor. The other lead coffins were all moved about the tomb. Some were standing up, some were upside down, leaning against walls, all out of position. So basically, the whole tomb was put back together then. This time it was the coffins of Samuel Brewster. That's the lead one at the bottom of Thomasina Clark on top. Then Thomas Chase's big lead coffin with the young infant Samuel Brewster Ames on top of him. Then Dorcas with her little sister, Anne Maria. So they were all sort of put back, and I expect Mrs. Clark was tidied up a little bit. Lord Combermere, I need to tell you, this is this chap here. So Stapleton Cotton, 1st Viscount Combermere. He was the governor of the island at the time. When they put the vault back together on that final occasion, sand was sprinkled all around the coffins and all around the grounds, and the heavy marble seal was replaced and cemented in place. Then Lord Combermere put his own governor's seal on the coffin, and he was interested in the case as a citizen as well as in his official capacity as a governor. And in 1819, a year after the last entombment, he decided to get a group of strong workmen and return back to the vault of his own volition, just to see if anything had moved since the 6 burials in there. So the seal was intact, the concrete fixings on the slab were untouched, and the gate was closed. The sand was undisturbed, and no water had entered the tomb since its closure. But the coffins were everywhere, upside down, again leaning against the stone walls of the tomb, and in some cases very heavily marked. So as you can imagine, and I think they've given it enough time now, that was the final case, that was the final straw for the governor and the families. It was arranged that all of the coffins would be moved out of the tomb forthwith, and nobody would be buried in there again. There have been reinterred throughout the same graveyard, but nobody was going to be reinterred in the Chase Vault again. So nobody has lain in the Chase Vault since those disinterments, and the mysterious tomb remains alone, unloved, unmaintained, as I'll show you a picture in a bit, and sort of a strange silent witness to this event it hosted 2 centuries ago. But we just talked a little bit about Lord Combermere there, and obviously he was in charge of the island and as such in charge of the tomb. The name itself might ring a bell to you. It wasn't the last time that anybody who was interested in the paranormal would hear the name Lord Combermere. So years later, Lord Combermere's son, who was Colonel Wellington Henry Stapleton Cotton, the 2nd Viscount Combermere, who had been born on the island of Barbados in 1818, he spent his life as a soldier and a Conservative politician, and he died at the age of 73 in St. James Place, London. While his funeral was taking place at Wrenbury in Cheshire, near the family seat, with all family and staff of the house in attendance, his sister-in-law had left a camera in the library room, and she left it with the shutter open. Then she went off to the church. This is how the story goes. When everybody returned from the funeral and they examined the photograph plates, they were astonished to see this among the photos. This is apparently exactly, well, this is Lord Combermere, according to the family and staff. There was nobody else who would have been sitting there at the time. There was nobody else in the house at the time, and this is exactly what he looked like. This photo was taken when Lord Combermere's coffin was being taken from the church to the graveyard 4 miles away at the time. So there's no way he could have been there for that photograph. So that's just like a really brief introduction to the Chase Vault. But what really happened at the Chase Vault all those years ago? I think, sadly, we have to accept that all of the accounts are all sort of tainted with the sense of fiction, really, in that there's very little in the way of first-hand accounts of the stories available. There was a Mr. Nathaniel Lucas who claimed to have been at the opening of the tomb in 1819, 1820, and he saw the bodies being reburied throughout the graveyard. He was a very unsubstantiated source, unreliable and quite possibly dishonest. So even though his account was never published, it probably would have been superfluous anyway, even if it ever did appear in print. Maybe nobody at the time thought to really make a written record of it until the travellers from the east arrived. There was another account given at the time by a Sir Algernon Aspinall called An Unsolved Barbados Mystery. Obviously, we heard the account by James Edward Alexander, and then there was another by an Andrew Lang, who managed to get hold of death and burial records in the parish at the time, none of which really explains the cause of the mystery. Not even Lord Combermere, who from all accounts that do exist was present there and opening the vaults and sealing the vaults. He didn't leave any written record or any account of his time or what happened there. And of course, that would have been amazing to hear. But then there's another interesting theory that involves the introduction of maybe a Masonic ritual angle to this story. So there's a US skeptic paranormal investigator called Joe Nickell, who looked in depth at some very famous paranormal cases, including the Mothman of Point Pleasant and the disappearance of Ambrose Bierce and the Turin Shroud. And he investigated the Chase Vault as part of his role as a full-time researcher with the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry in 1982. And he pointed to several structural features of the vault, suggesting that the events were part of a somewhat complex Masonic allegory, as opposed to historical fact. For example, the idea of a secret or mysterious vault is a central tenet of Freemasonry, as being symbolic of death, obviously, and as such, the only place where divine truth is to be found. The arched ceiling of the tomb refers to the Royal Arch Decree in Masonry, and the ceiling of the tomb in cement, of course, points back to Masons again. So Joe Nickell was heavily of the opinion that this was actually an allegory and not a true story, and was just done as being something that pointed to Freemasons' involvement. Maybe the story was buried, excuse the pun, because basically with the God-fearing nature of the islanders and their reluctance to acknowledge what would actually be tantamount to a direct challenge to a lot of their Christian beliefs, maybe they were scared that there was a form of voodoo magic involved, because the seething resentment of the slaves, especially those who worked for Thomas Chase, and maybe they felt that that had occasioned sort of the ominous events. Could the slaves themselves have done it? Did the slaves do it? Looking at the facts, it was the only vault ever to be affected the way it was. The slaves hated Thomas Chase and his cruel treatment of them, and rage is known to be an emotion that can elevate and mortal passions into superhuman strength on occasion. But how would slaves have remained undetected, replaced the sand and the governor's seal, and moved back the massive marble slab undetected over a total of, say, 8 years, if you're looking at the Chase, Clark, and Brewster burials, or over 30 years if you go back as far as when James Eliot had been in the tomb? Could a natural disaster be responsible, a natural order of things? We already know the church itself had to be rebuilt 5 times to get to its present form. It was destroyed by flood when it was closer down to the ground and nearer the beach. That was in the 17th century. And then afterwards, it was destroyed a further 3 or 4 times by fire, flood, hurricane, and earthquakes. But a few factors do make the natural disaster narrative quite unlikely. There were no notable hurricanes or earthquakes during the vault's active years between 1812 and 1820. In addition to that, even though excess floodwater in a tomb could potentially cause the movement of coffins, especially wooden ones, it would be very hard to imagine how much water would be needed to lift a heavy lead coffin that had taken between 6 to 8 men to lay in place in the first place. And as well as that, the island itself, as we said, sits on that limestone strata with coral. And so if any excess floodwater had entered the tomb or any of the tombs there, then it would have actually just gone straight out through the floor of the tomb back into the earth. So it's unlikely it would have stayed around long enough, or there would have been enough standing water to lift the coffins. Maybe then the saddest but the most simple explanation of all for this is that it simply didn't happen. Could it be that there was like a heady mixture of folklore and class division and racial tension, and there was freely available rum, and there was ghost stories and anecdotes, and some of these anecdotes were even purported to have come from the rector of the parish of Christchurch himself, so he was sort of spreading it about, and upping the ante a little bit with the gossip that was going on at the time. Did that all collude to create this wonderful spine-chilling tale, which has somehow spilled into the minds of people like Alexander? And then obviously he carried it away across the waves. And then anybody who was interested in the potential evidence for life after death, this is an amazing story for that. It's sort of, it's one you have to think about in terms of absolute proof of life after death if you subscribe to what happened here. One of the intriguing things for me personally, there was a discovery made by Benjamin Radford, who's traveled to the island a few times. And when he visited the tomb, he examined the interior of the walls and the ceiling in 2011. So it is a very sort of recent discovery. And he saw that despite heavy lead-lined coffins having supposedly been thrown against these brick walls like children's toys, there was no marks or damage on any of the walls. So apart from the sort of ceaseless march of age and time leading to a steady but natural erosion of the structural integrity, there really was no marks that would have been caused by lead coffins hitting the stone walls. So with that in mind, one of two things must surely be the case here. A, that the story is a fabrication from beginning to end, intertwined here and there with some truism, some island history, and some mischievous elaborations over the course of the years. Or whatever or whomever moved these coffins have massive strength. Conservative estimates say it took at least 6 strong men to move even the coffin of the 12-year-old Dorcas. Some might say inhuman strength, and a capacity for unearthly stealth and capriciousness that it's not possible to find, at least not in human form. So I know which theory I prefer there. How about you? And we're just going to, now I have to tell you about this. This is my trip to, where are we? Yeah, we found the vault very easily when we went. I went back in, went there in 2018. It was my 40th birthday. And I had got my hands on this book that I'm going to tell you about in a minute. And this is some pictures of the tomb that I took myself. It was a pleasure to visit. It was quite a steep hill to go. If you do go, bear in mind, you're walking up quite a steep hill from where the taxi drops you at the bottom of the road, and you walk up to the church. But we noticed there was beautiful scenery. There was lovely noises like tropical birds and insects and everything. And there was a wedding going on in the church at the top. Like I said, that's the fourth or fifth incarnation of that church. Yeah, so we took lots of pictures. I just want to say here, I want to put in a little caveat here. Be aware that in these pictures, I was A, a little drunk, B, more than a little sunburned, C, evidently dressed as some sort of, I don't know, educationally challenged Where's Wally or something, and D, carrying a little bit of holiday weight around everywhere. So be kind. The tomb, as you can see, is actually really small. And my first thought was not just how did they get 6 to 7 coffins in here, but how do they have the room to be scattered? It's really strange. There's a rusty old gate there, but the marble slab is gone. So you're welcome to go and visit. And if you happen to be in the Caribbean, it's well worth seeing. Like I said, we couldn't go into the church because of the wedding that was going on. So unfortunately, we will have to make a return visit at some point in the near future. And this is the last bit I want to tell you about. This is the book that started it all for me. I know everybody who's into the paranormal sort of has this origin story of how they got into it. Yeah, it's by Roger Bohr and Nigel Blundell, and it complemented really well when I got to the only other book on my ghost bookshelf at the time, which was Giles Brandreth's Big Book of Ghosts. The shelf has expanded year on year, and so has its owner, as you can see from the pictures. It's probably about 200 to 300 ghost books in the shelf now. And if anything, it sort of confirms what my husband calls kind of a tragic midlife crisis. But I like the bookshelf anyway, and I'm sure you all like ghost books too. So I still have the book, and the stories in it that would be very familiar to the paranormal lovers among you. Things that we would all recognize: the Amityville Horror, the faces in the floor in Belmez in Spain, the haunting of Willington Mill, the Enfield Poltergeist. It's got Borley, Berkeley Square, John Bell, and the Tennessee Witch. And another story for me that's absolutely fascinating: the ghostly flyers of the Florida Everglades, who, after their deaths in a crash, they possessed an onboard microwave of all things, so that they could warn their colleagues who were still flying about any manufacturing and engineering deficiencies for future flights. So it was the story, however, of the Chase Vault that really got me started and really grabbed my attention. I was 6 years old. I was sitting in a pink bedroom in the west of Ireland, and I just swore that years later I would go, and I did. And it was 34 years later, and I was quite sozzled after having a few rum cocktails. Like I say, it was the day of my 40th birthday. I was determined to go on the actual day because that's what made the whole trip for me. I'd had some breakfast on the terrace, some rum cocktails, and I sort of entered this tomb and just stared around it in amazement. And my husband and kids were standing outside. And I look back now and I think they were probably wondering if between the three of them, they could possibly lift the slab, put it back, leave me there and go back to the water slides. I'm fairly sure that's what they were thinking at the time. But yeah, I just wanted to share with you my passion for this story, and I hope you enjoyed it. It's an amazing story. It's never really had a satisfactory solution for me because of all the theories and the postulations that have been put out there. I don't think anyone's come really close to solving this. If it was natural causes, you would see it in other vaults throughout the churchyard. It was the only vault that was affected. If you've got any theories on it, I would absolutely love to hear them. I'm going to put up my email address, or you can contact me through ASAP and CJ and everything. I hope you enjoyed it. If you've got any questions, ask me, let me know. But yeah, thanks for listening. CJ, over to you.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. That was really excellent. Okay, if we hang on, stop sharing screen for a moment.
Okay. Do I need?
Yep.
Should I stop sharing it?
Yeah, just stop sharing it, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Right. Okay. So, good evening, welcome, and I still haven't got to Barbados in the last 35 minutes. That was, yeah, Claire, you were wonderful. Enjoyed your talk very much. I think that says it all. That was a fantastic talk. Okay, let's see if Loz has turned up as well, because she likes to help with the questions. I can't see. Oh, I'll deal with the questions tonight then. So let's start. Brilliant talk, says Patricia. Yeah, that was fantastic. That was really enjoyable. Claire, did you record it as well? Because I kept losing sound halfway through.
No, I just about managed to turn on the screen sharing, Christian, so you might be expecting a bit much of me there.
Okay. No. I make it up as I go along and kind of guess, which is why we do loads of talks, because my recording is often rubbish. I have recorded it, I think, successfully. What happened was at many points I lost the sound. Did anyone else? I did apologise once for that. Did anyone else actually lose the sound at some point? No? It was just me.
Just
okay,
you.
There's something odd with my computer tonight. Then apologies then if I apologise to the sound over for the sound quality over you at one point. It's because I couldn't hear you at all for about 2 minutes. Okay, let's start with the questions. So, yeah, some mics were open and causing a bit of noise. That unfortunately happens to us all. Doesn't it, Loz? Yes, I'm teasing her. Last week, Loz gets to sit there and turn off mics as they come open. Ben Radford says the Barbados coffin story is mythical. What's your response to this? That's a question from Robert.
I think, honestly, if you're looking at it from a practical point of view, I just don't think there is enough evidence to prove that it actually happened. There's any substantial evidence to prove it really happened. More from the point of view of the first-hand accounts being missing. As I said, there were a couple, but even those first-hand accounts at the time came from stories. And there was nobody really present at the vault. I mean, if you take into account the words of Nathaniel Lucas, he says he was there. There's no reason to think he actually really was there.